Hello again, everyone. Pastor Bob here with your midweek Bible break as we're moving toward Palm Sunday and the end of Lent. Holy Week is next week, and we are wrapping up our series on the story of Joseph. I say we're wrapping up this series, but I hope you're seeing this as a foreshadowing of the events that we're going to be talking about during Holy Week. The story of Joseph has some parallels to the gospel story, and particularly how it ends in chapter 50 with Joseph saying, what was meant for evil, God actually made into good. And that's really the story of Holy Week, and especially the story of Good Friday, where we recognize a horrific event, Jesus being nailed to the cross, actually being something that was turned to good for the whole world. But before we get to Genesis chapter 50 and before we get to Palm Sunday, Genesis 48 and 49 give us a little bit of insight into the blessing of Jacob over his sons. This is going to be important for the history of the Israelites. It's going to be important as they go into the Exodus and into the Promised Land. But it also gives us some ways of thinking ahead in the Bible about how this family is going to become a nation that is going to be eventually enslaved in Egypt and then be freed by God to go into the Promised Land, and from there, setting the conditions for the gospel story, for the arrival of Jesus, and the good news that comes for the whole world. As God intended from the beginning, by calling Abraham, now this movement is beginning to go wider as this family moves to becoming a nation. In Genesis 48, we get Jacob's deathbed blessings. Genesis 48 and 49. In chapter 48, he's going to give his blessing over Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. But these deathbed blessings, and we've seen this before in Genesis, we saw it with Isaac blessing Jacob and Esau, and that whole intrigue about Jacob coming in and stealing the blessing from Esau. These are more than simple wishes or prayers, dying wishes. In fact, they kind of act like the last will and testament of the dying patriarch. And so in that sense, they're considered binding. Whatever was said there was something that the family would respect and carry forward. And we've also seen that the privileged status of being the actual firstborn is not necessarily determined by birth order. You might be the firstborn, but you might not get the privileges of the firstborn. Remember that the firstborn was supposed to get two portions of the inheritance, a double portion, but we've seen already how the older often winds up serving the younger. That's the pattern here in Genesis. Isaac is younger than Ishmael. He is the child of promise. Jacob is the second one born. Esau is the oldest, but Jacob is the one through whom the covenant goes. And that's going to continue here at the end of Genesis as well. That pattern persists. Because in Genesis 48, Jacob's going to bless Joseph by blessing his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, by, in effect, adopting them to the status of his own sons. Now, they are his grandsons, so he's not really adopting them, but he's going to elevate them to the status of his own sons. And that's going to be important for what happens later on in the Exodus, later on when Israel enters into the Promised Land. But let's look in depth at what Joseph's blessing, or what Jacob's blessing of Joseph's sons actually means. Well, of course, we know Joseph has two sons, Manasseh and then Ephraim, and they are born to Joseph's wife, who is Egyptian. She's an Egyptian princess, the daughter of a priest, and therefore she is not an Israelite. And remember all the hubbub about marrying outside of the family, outside of the faith structure. Well, that's what Joseph has done because he was there in Egypt. But remember also that their names mean, Manasseh means forgetting. Joseph names him that way because he's forgotten about his past and wants to put all of that aside. And then he names Ephraim, which means fruitful, because he's been fruitful in this foreign land. And he has been fruitful. He's risen to power. He's now got a wife and two sons. He's settled there. And of course, we get the great encounter he has with his brothers. And now we see the circle closing as the story reaches its climax. But in chapter 48, verse 3, Jacob, in talking with Joseph goes to see him because he knows he's dying and he wants to take his sons in order for them to get a blessing. And there at the deathbed, Jacob recounts God's promises of the covenant to Joseph. And Jacob is referring back to Genesis chapter 28 and that story of the dream of the stairway to heaven. He also recounts the death of his beloved wife Rachel near Bethlehem, and she is buried near there. But here also, Jacob is going to adopt Joseph's sons as his own, and he assigns them a portion of the inheritance territory that they're going to have later on in Canaan. Now remember, this is going to happen way down the road. More than 400 years later is when this is going to happen. So neither Manasseh nor Ephraim are personally going to go to the promised land, but their descendants are going to do so. And if you are reading Genesis through the lens of an Israelite who is living in a later time, post-Exodus, post-exile even, or during the monarchy, you're seeing this as another origin story for the tribes of Israel and why there are the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, even though they are not biological sons of Jacob. So what is Jacob doing here? Well, he's in effect giving Joseph a double portion of inheritance by giving his sons the status of tribal patriarchs of Israel. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but essentially what's happening is Joseph's place in the tribal system, he is going to be replaced by his two sons. They're each going to kind of take over his role as patriarch when Israel enters the promised land. More about that in a minute. But what's interesting about this text here is that in chapter 48, beginning at verse 12, when Jacob gives a blessing to the boys, Joseph lines them up in birth order. He puts Manasseh first, he puts Ephraim second. But when Jacob, whose eyesight is failing, just like Isaac's eyesight was failing when he gave the blessing mistakenly to Jacob over Esau, what Jacob does here is he crosses his hands when blessing the boys. He puts his right hand on top of Ephraim, who's the youngest. The right hand was to be reserved for the oldest. So we see this continuing pattern we've seen in Genesis, this reversal of birth order blessing. Joseph tries to take Jacob's hands off the boys and put them on what he considers to be the right heads because he thinks that Jacob can't see them correctly. But Jacob says, no, I want to do this way because this has been the pattern going forward. The older is going to serve the younger. Ephraim is going to have a greater status than Manasseh. And so the significance of the blessing then in verse 16 is, may they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth. Now here again, this is interesting because Ephraim and Manasseh are born in Egypt to an Egyptian mother, and yet they have a full inheritance in Israel. They are considered to be sons of Abraham and Isaac, as well as Jacob. And so Joseph's tribal land and inheritance is going to be lived out through these sons who are considered to be full Israelites, even though they are half Egyptian. And we might be reading into the text here a little bit, but I do think in some ways this foreshadows the fact that Gentiles are going to be included in this covenant. God promises Abraham, you remember back in Genesis 12, that through him, through his blessing, all the families of the earth, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And in effect, I think that's what's happening here at the end of Genesis. That covenant God gives with Abraham now is being played out through these two boys who, again, are not pure Hebrews, and yet they're going to be carriers of the covenant. They're part of the covenant promise. And that's going to be a theme that continues to roll forward as we go through the Bible until we get to the New Testament, where that door is opened wide in the book of Acts, where the Spirit is poured out on all flesh, where Peter engages Cornelius, where Gentiles are welcomed into the faith without having to become ritually or ethnically Jewish first. So all of that is kind of an inkling here in Genesis 48. I may be reading into the text with that a little bit, but it seems to fit the pattern. Now in chapter 49 then, the emphasis now turns from Joseph's sons to the other sons of Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob that we've been focusing on over the last several weeks. This is the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel. But it's interesting to look at this and say, at what point are we talking about the 12 tribes? Because here in Genesis 49, the 12 tribes essentially are the 12 sons of Jacob. He's blessing them as individuals, as patriarchs of their own family, and giving them a foretaste of what their life is going to be like when their families enter the promised land. Again, these patriarchs, they go back to Canaan to bury their father, as we see at the end of at the beginning of chapter 50, but they're not going to settle back in Canaan. They're going to live and die in Egypt. It's going to be their offspring and generations later that's going to go back to that promised land, and things are going to change. And there are some changes that take place. These sons actually have different foci, like Levi, who will become a tribe of priests that has no land given to them in the promised land when Israel enters into it. Why? Because the tribe of Levites is a tribe of priests. They're to be the priestly class of Israel. The tribe of Simeon, for example, has villages that are scattered across Judah's territory. They don't really have their own territory, tribal territory with boundaries and etc. So it's interesting to compare the different lists of the tribes of Israel from Genesis until we get to Deuteronomy, when Israel's about to enter into the promised land. So here again, in Genesis, we see the listing of the 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin, just as we've been reading through the text. But when we get to Deuteronomy, the list is somewhat different. There's Reuben and Simeon, but Levi, again, does not get any land because it's a priestly class. Judah, who we're going to talk about here in a minute, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali. But rather than a tribe of Joseph, in the promised land, land is divided between Ephraim and Manasseh, the tribes named after Joseph's sons. And then there's the tribe of Benjamin. So if you replace Levi and you replace Joseph with Ephraim and Manasseh, that gives you that updated list of the 12 tribes as they settle in the land of Canaan. So you want to look at those two lists and look at them in terms of the time that they're being put forward, because this time here in Genesis is more about Joseph or about Jacob's sons, whereas we get to Deuteronomy and beyond, the names are a little bit different because of the way things have worked out with Levi and with the tribe of Joseph being given to his sons. I hope that makes sense. But Jacob's going to bless his sons individually, and these are interesting blessings because they do sort of give some inkling of what's going to happen to them, or why, in particular, the oldest, again, is not prime, but it's going to be one of the younger sons who's actually the leader. Reuben, for example, who is the firstborn. Remember, he's born to Leah. But he gets a curse almost from this. His blessing has kind of a curse to it because he went up on his father's bed. He slept with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. Remember, Bilhah was the mother of some of Jacob's other sons. But Reuben essentially sleeps with his father's concubine, one of his sort of half-brother mothers. It's very weird. And there's just one verse about it in chapter 35, verse 22. Here again, this family does not behave greatly throughout this process. So Reuben loses the right of being the firstborn if he was going to get it at any rate. Simeon and Levi are considered to be violent and conspiratorial and cruel. And that's a reference to Genesis 34. There's the story there about the Shechemites who are going to rape their sister Dinah. and Simeon and Levi are going to lead the charge to kill these Shechemites who have violated their sister. It's a story about them having them be circumcised, and then once they're sore, then they sweep in and kill them off. It's another really interesting story here in Genesis. I hope you've been finding that there's a lot of interesting stuff here in Genesis that people say, really, that was in the Bible? Well, yeah, it is. But the point of all of this is that it's the next son, Judah, who really emerges as the leader. And we've seen already in the text how Judah has kind of emerged. He's changed from Genesis 38 and that sordid tale of Judah and Tamar, which we talked about a few weeks ago. And now he has emerged as a courageous and compassionate leader. Remember, he offers to sacrifice himself for the sake of his father and his brother Benjamin when he believes that that Benjamin is going to be thrown in prison or remain as a slave. Of course, Joseph is really messing with him. Judah doesn't know that it's Joseph who's messing with him yet, but Joseph uses this moment as an opportunity to test Judah, and Judah passes the test. And because he passes the test, his brothers will not only defer to him, but praise him, Jacob says, and he's called the Lion of Judah. And that's a royal kind of announcement. Verse 10 in chapter 49, Jacob says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. This gives him primacy because from Judah is going to come the line of Israel's kings from David to Jesus. And here at the beginning of the Bible, sort of the end of the beginning here in Genesis, we get that image of the lion. And then in Revelation at the end of the Bible, Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He's a lion, but he's also the Lamb of God. Verses 11-12, prosperity is attributed to Judah. Of course, his tribe is primarily going to be the one that survives out of all of these 12 tribes after the exile. Some remnants of the other tribes will be around, but Judah really is primary. Jesus grows up in Judea. That becomes that place named after Judah. Just some notes about some of the other sons. Zebulun is going to settle on the coast, and so there's a reference there to him being on the Mediterranean coast of Canaan. Issachar foreshadows as a labor force. He's got a strong back, and he's going to serve his brothers. Dan shall judge his people. There's an inference here that they're a small tribe, but they're a dangerous one, kind of like a snake by the roadside. Verse 18, we get a sort of a little interlude. It looks like something that's sort of dropped in from a psalm where the writer says, I wait for your salvation, O Lord. It might indicate Dan's favored position as the seventh in the list. 7 is an important number in the Bible. It's a number of completeness. We don't know for sure, but that's just an interesting little interlude in the text. Gad will be raided by raiders, but will raid at their heels, perhaps indicating that tribe has a particular kind of military prowess. Asher is going to be known for agricultural productivity. Naphtali, it's a beautiful image of a doe, kind of an animal image, but some commentators suggest that what's really being said here is that from Naphtali come beautiful words. So it might be a tribe of warrior poets kind of thing. We don't know for sure. And then there's the tribe of Joseph named here. It will have a violent future, but will prevail with the help of God. And here we get some different names for God. Remember, the name of God was not to be spoken, but these other names for God begin to appear here in Genesis. The Mighty One, the Shepherd, the Rock of Israel. So it's not surprising that Joseph's blessing from Jacob is the longest of the brothers. It indicates his favored status and his national and political greatness. Joseph gets a lot of blessing, but again, where is the covenant line going to go through? The royal line is going to go through Judah. And when they get into the promised land, Joseph is not going to be considered to be a tribe, but rather broken into 2 tribes, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Benjamin is the youngest son and the smallest tribe, but they're also known for military prowess. We know that they have 2 famous descendants. King Saul is a Benjamite, the first king of Israel. And later on, the Apostle Paul who's going to be a fierce defender of the faith. He's also from the tribe of Benjamin. So again, these tribes, remnants of them, are still around. Judah's going to be primary. But this is important stuff to know as you're getting ready to move into the rest of the Old Testament. When you start reading through Exodus, Joshua, Judges, for example, all those things are really important. Well, in verse 33, Jacob dies and he's gathered to his people. And the question now for Joseph's brothers is going to be what comes next. At the beginning of chapter 50, we get a very elaborate funeral that is going to be held for Jacob. His body's going to be embalmed. He's going to be taken back to Canaan, buried in the same cave where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah are buried. It's the family tomb. But what happens after that? That's the question. Now that Jacob is dead, will Joseph now finally take out his revenge on his brothers? That will take us to Genesis chapter 50, where we'll learn that no, Joseph is going to keep extending that forgiveness. And here at the very end of Genesis, God is doing what he's been doing at the beginning, and Joseph is the one who gets to name it. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, to preserve a people. So we're going to look at that on Sunday. We're also going to be talking about how that connects to Holy Week and Palm Sunday through Good Friday, why sometimes suffering is for the good of others as Jesus suffers for us, that God can take some of the most horrific things in this world and make them into good. That's been the witness of the Joseph story. It's going to be the witness going forward. It's the story of the gospel. Well, thanks for joining me for this midweek Bible break. I do want to tell you that we will not have midweek Bible break next week, or which is Holy Week, or the following week, as I will be in Romania on a mission trip, which I'm really looking forward to. There with Global Hope, I'm taking a team of 7 of us here from Aldersgate to visit our orphanages and partners there in Romania. So we'll be back with the midweek Bible break when we get into our next series, which will begin on May 4th. It's going to be a great series in 1 John. So I hope you'll look forward to joining us then. We'll bring the midweek Bible break back then. So I look forward to seeing you then. Have a great Holy Week if I don't see you in person. Blessings.